Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. Today we want to talk about a book entitled Interpreting the Pentateuch by Peter T. Vogt. That's a German pronunciation for V-O-G-T. To help us discuss and work our way through this book, we have Aaron Peer with us from Charter Oak Church in Churubusco, Northern Indiana. Aaron, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Bateman.
As we think about this book on interpreting the Pentateuch, can you give us a kind of an overview of the book? What does Peter do as he works his way through this book? What are the major sections of this book?
Yeah, I mean, he starts out talking about the different genres that you find in the Pentateuch, the law, and you also have narrative, and he talks about sensitivities to each of those genres. Next thing he does is he kind of fleshes out the main themes, of each of the books of the Pentateuch, the sovereignty of God, seriousness of sin, and also the grace of God. Next, he talks a little bit about textual criticism and the different types of texts that we have. You have the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint and so forth. He talks about ancient Near Eastern parallels, and kind of the relationship between those and the Pentateuch. Then he moves into how to interpret the Pentateuch, talking about context. Make sure you pay attention to context. Make sure you pay attention to something he calls co-text, which is just the literary context. And then he leads a discussion on how, once we've interpreted it correctly, how can we bring it into today? And how can we contextualize it into our life? And then he kind of just uses a couple of examples from the law and from narrative sections in the Pentateuch as well to kind of show the whole process from start to finish. And he kind of wraps it up that way.
Good. All right. Very good. So as you think about each one of these sections, as you're reading through this book and as you have read through each one of these sections, thinking back on the book, what were some of these sections that you thought were extremely helpful to you as you were reading through Peter's work? What was it that you found helpful, perhaps even a surprise that you were unaware of?
Yeah, I mean, I really liked the section on the major themes. And the reason why is I liked his focus on the grace of God found in the Pentateuch. I think normally we think about the seriousness of sin and maybe the sovereignty of God when we think about the Pentateuch, but often we don't think about the grace of God. And maybe that's because, in the New Testament, Paul and the author of Hebrews and other authors are kind of dealing with a misrepresentation of the law that people were using in that early church to abuse people. And so it's kind of helpful to go back to the original intention of the law, that God gave it through his grace. God wanted these people to have a direction in life, and he wanted them to be a light to the nations. And so I thought that emphasis was very good, that he went through and he showed the grace of God all throughout the Pentateuch. I thought another thing that I really enjoyed about the book was looking at the parallels. First of all, to the law, I mean, you had things like the Code of Hammurabi, and as far as narrative goes, I mean, you had the Gilgamesh epic and the Enuma Elish and several others that he kind of gave an overview of or a survey of. This is what these are about. And I think oftentimes you come across these works and commentaries, but you don't really get kind of an overview of what the entire scope of those books was like. So I enjoyed that. And then he kind of talked about the relationship between those books and the Pentateuch. And, often you hear from critical scholars, the Old Testament or the law is derivative. And he goes to point out the big worldview differences between what Moses did and what these other works were doing, and where Moses diverges from them on pretty significant points. And so I really enjoyed that as well. And I like seeing some of the views fleshed out for how Christians understand the law today. I do think he probably could have made that section a little bit bigger. I think there's only like 3 main views there. I think there are definitely more views out there that he could have brought in to kind of flesh that out a little bit better. But he did point out, some of the difficulties with this idea of dividing it into ceremonial, civil, and moral, and how subjective that is, and how dangerous that can be, because you can just say, well, I want to follow this law because I want to follow this law. That one I don't have to follow because I don't like it. And so I liked that he pointed that out and kind of fleshed out other ways to understand the law.
Very good. All right. I like that that emphasis that he's trying to underscore the similarities and yet the differences between the law and the big picture. That sounds like it's be very interesting to investigate. What, as you think back on your reading, what were some things you wished Peter had covered, or what did you find disappointing about the book that perhaps wasn't so helpful in the interpretation section? Not so much on the preaching section, but as you think your way through the book, what were some things you wish he had covered a little better and maybe even been disappointed about?
Yeah, like I just said, I think he could have fleshed out some more views on the law. I mean, I didn't really see mine represented, and I know Douglas Moo holds to the view that Douglas Moo gives in the Counterpoint series. This was the view I hold to, but I didn't really see that quite fleshed out as much in what he was doing there, pretended like it didn't exist. I also wish he probably would have admitted the subjectivity of his own view. I understand, he's looking at the context and the co-text, which what he calls literary context, and he's trying to get to the heart of why was this law given, what's the principle here, and then how can we bring it into our context. But once you start to kind of cross that river and you try to come into our town, there's a lot of subjectivity that's going on there, and I don't think that he kind of admits that. I think that he kind of, and in that way, he comes across with these contextualizations that seem to be binding according to him, and some of those things that he thinks are binding, I kind of cringe at a little bit. So, I kind of wish he would have just admitted, okay, recontextualization is not as easy as we might like it to be. There is some messy things as we try to understand culture it was written into and how it differs from the culture that we're in now. The covenant that it was written under and the covenant that we now find ourselves in today. And I don't know that he gave enough justice to the change in covenant that came because of the coming of Jesus. I wish he would have at least admitted that or kind of probed that a little bit more. I think, for an example, he talks about the capital punishments for certain crimes like blasphemy. Should we do those today? And he seems to suggest that the only reason that we shouldn't do that today is because Christians aren't a state. The church isn't a state like Israel was a state. And so in my mind, I'm like, well, what if the church is a state? We can go to the Vatican City. The church is a state there. There are other countries in the history of the church where, the church and state have merged, so that it was okay for them to just kill people for blasphemy. So I just wish that I would have saw that fleshed out just a little bit more, the differences between the old covenant and us who live under the new covenant. I also wish that there would have been more discussion on how the New Testament views the law, like how guys like Paul and the author of Hebrews, how did they see the law? How did they think that the law applied to today? And I didn't see any interaction with that. And I know he's writing a book on the Pentateuch, and he's only got so much space, but, he does make a big deal about how the purity laws are kind of binding on us in some sense, and I would be interested to see him interact with what Jesus had to say about food laws and things like that. I think that would have been, kind of a great addition to what he did there.
Okay.
So that's some of the things I wish he would have included in the interpretation section.
Okay. Well, now let's go to that preaching section. Pentateuch doesn't strike me as being one of the easiest places to go to preach a lot of sermons from.
Right.
So thinking about his suggestions on how to preach the Pentateuch, did you find as a pastor that section very helpful?
I didn't. I wish he would have partnered with maybe a preacher or homiletical guy. He even admits in the book that he's only preaches a handful of times a year, and I think that kind of comes across. And I'm not saying that his method is wrong or his method is bad. I mean, it's great, but is it practical? I mean, is it really how I would be able to preach the Pentateuch? I wish somebody would have come alongside of him and said, okay, here are some creative ways that you can preach the Pentateuch, because I think he seems to assume you're just going to preach it from start to finish, just kind of expositionally preach through that. But then in one of the examples he brings up is the example of Joseph fleeing from Potiphar's wife. And he bemoans the fact that preachers get up there and use that to talk about sexual ethics, when in reality it's about God fulfilling his promises to Abraham. And even though Joseph is being harmed and put down and maligned, that God carries him through. And how true is that? But if I'm going to preach straight through the book of Genesis, I'm going to be preaching that every week. And so I would like to saw some, okay, well, here's how we throw variety in there then, because you can't just preach the main message of the book every week or it's going to get very monotonous. So I wish you would have kind of partnered with maybe a homiletical guy or found some creative ways to kind of preach the Pentateuch.
Okay. Now, I take it you have preached at times Pentateuch, books from the Pentateuch. What books have you found helpful as you think through your preparation and preparing for sermons, for teaching and preaching?
I've used a lot of very helpful works that I helped me understand the Old Testament in general and maybe the Pentateuch specifically. One of those books for me, probably the landmark book in my mind is Chisholm's book From Exegesis to Exposition. I know that's a lot more technical than these books in this series are. You need a little bit more knowledge of Hebrew syntax and grammar and things like that. But man, it is a fundamentally awesome book on how to interpret and preach and teach the Old Testament. I'd recommend that to anybody. As far as understanding law in particular, Kaiser and Bonson have that counterpoint book out on the 5 views of the law and gospel, and I think that's good for anybody trying to preach the law. And that doesn't have to be just the law found in the Pentateuch. It can be any laws found throughout the entire Old Testament, New Testament, wherever. I think it's very interesting to kind of think through the issue of how does the Mosaic law, how does it relate to today? How does law, how should we interpret it? How should we apply it? How should we recontextualize it? And it's a very good point-counterpoint introduction to all these different views. So I'd recommend that to anybody trying to think through this idea, law and gospel. How do we bring it to today? And the last book I'd recommend is Scott McKnight's book, Blue Parakeet. You might not agree with his conclusions, but I think his method there on just how we tend to pick and choose which laws we like and which laws we don't like, and how we need to move towards a more consistent hermeneutic is it makes you think really well about, okay, how do I filter the law through what Jesus did, and what does that mean, and how can I apply it to today?
Very good. Well, Aaron, thank you so much for being with us and giving us some insight, an overview of Peter's book, Interpreting the Pentateuch, as well as some insight as to the strengths and weaknesses and some additional works that might be helpful in our interpreting and preaching from the Pentateuch. And thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.